Because yeah, it's
It is early for me, that is true. I appreciate it. I've enjoyed being a part of the group. I was really pretty active until COVID hit. And once COVID hit, just, I don't know, got real conservative on things. And so anyway, it's been glad to be back and getting reconnected with a lot of the group. Well, I guess I'll start off with kids. We have three boys. Their ages are 46, 41, and 46, 44, and 41. And I'll pass this photo around. There's a reason I'm going to do that. This is when they were 7, 5, and 2. And so the boys, a few years ago, decided to replicate the photo. So they went out and they live in 3 different states. So for them to pull this off was really, so they tried to get the same clothes and and they tried to sit. They told us later they tried to sit in the same order, and they're like this, because they're all pretty good. But anyway, it was sort of a hoot. Our oldest son Andy lives in Portland, Oregon. He basically, when he graduated from college, went to Gainesville College in Gainesville, Georgia, and ended up going to Virginia Beach area and Regent University. And he was a drama theater major, and his idea was he was going to major in drama theater. And he got out there. He was married at the time. He got out there, and I gave him a call and says, I really think God's calling me to go into the School of Divinity. So he ended up getting his master's in divinity at Regent University, then basically did campus ministry. And a number of years ago decided to get his doctorate degree and moved out to Portland, Oregon, and got his doctorate degree and started teaching at George Fox University as a teacher of Christian studies, and did that until COVID hit. And in 2000, small colleges struggling, he ended up getting laid off, and so now he works for a technology company doing training and marketing and stuff. Our middle son, Michael, he went to Auburn, and if you had given me a list of 500 occupations, what he ended up doing would have never even been on the list. He was originally going to be a youth minister, and another long story I won't get into, but he is a policeman with DeKalb County, and he's been with them for 18 years. 12 of those 18 years he's been undercover narcotics. And just now, in fact, on Monday, he's getting moving over to homicide. So that's been an interesting. He's a sergeant, and which is another interesting story. Youngest son, Nick, went to Carson Newman College, small college up in Tennessee, and when he was at PCBC, the youth minister, Alan Jones, used to do World Changers every summer, where they'd take the students and go to construction on small houses and low-income houses in different cities. And so when he did that every summer after freshman, sophomore, junior, senior year, and so in college, he went on staff with North American Mission Board and did home builders for 3 years in college. And in one of those things, he ended up meeting this young lady from Tennessee, and they ended up getting married. They have 4 children. Mason, who's 15, Owen's 13, Harper's 9, and Sadie is 5. And he is started working off with Enterprise Rent-A-Car, and one thing led to another, and he's always volunteered with youth. And his youth minister at his church said, hey, would you like to be a youth minister intern? And so he did that. Then they hired him as a middle school youth minister, and he's now a senior youth minister, youth pastor up in Knoxville, Tennessee, where I grew up. So, and I didn't tell you about Michael. Andy and Michael are 22 months apart. Andy has a 20-year-old and an 18-year-old, sophomore and freshman in sophomore in college, senior in high school. Michael's 22 months younger, and he has a 3-year-old. So we have everything from 20 to 3-year-olds in terms of grandkids. I guess I'll start with my dad, and I'll pass this picture on with my parents and my brother. This was their 50th wedding anniversary. My dad grew up in North Georgia in a little small town called Eton, which is north of another small town called Chatsworth. And just to give you an idea, it wasn't until the 1980s that Eton got their only stop sign. And so he grew up there, and he was the oldest of 5 children, and his family were tenant farmers, which means that they would go on somebody else's property. There would be a little rental house that they would live in, and they would basically till the land, plant, do all the farming. And then once a year, when the crops came in, that's sort of when they would make, their money. So my dad was the oldest of 5, and when he was 12 years old, his mother, who was 29 years old, died of what's called consumption, tuberculosis. And so all of a sudden he had to grow up pretty quick. He ended up skipping the 3rd grade because he was pretty smart for his age. And back then, high school only went through the 11th grade. So when he was 16 years old, he graduated from high school. And when he was 17, he'd stayed on the farm for a year. His dad said, "This is no life for you." He said, you need to do something else. So my dad and a couple of his buddies decided to go to Knoxville, Tennessee. My grandfather gave him all the cash he had, which was $10. And he gets on a bus and goes to Knoxville and had to figure out what he's going to do. And so he ended up going to business school, and tell you some other stories about my dad later on. My mother, she grew up in Kentucky. My grandfather was born in 1886, and he had ended up being an orphan at the age of 14, and pretty much had to figure his own way of how he's going to live. And he ended up putting himself through college, ended up going to law school. He had a pretty successful insurance agency up in Harlan, Kentucky. And one of the things that the guys would do, he was 32 years old, one of the things that the guys would do is they would go down to the train station, because the train came in twice a week, to see who was getting off the train. Well, one day this young lady's getting off the train, and she was 20 years old, had just graduated from 2 years of college to teach school in Harlan. And so he ended up marrying my grandmother, so they were 22 months apart. Another little interesting tidbit is my dad's father, Jasper Campbell, and my grandmother on my mother's side, Mame Highball, we all share the same birthday. So it's neat to have the same birthday, March the 10th, as 2 of your grandparents. So when I was, my mom and dad always went to church. They actually met at church. That's another long story, but met at church on a Sunday night. And he was 19, she was 17. She was still in high school. And, Dad's, going through school, trying to get his first job. And they would have gotten married, except World War II came along. And so they ended up dating for 7 years, ended up getting married right before he was discharged in 1945, in December of 1944. And they got married and joined, my mother was already attending there, but in 1945 joined Central Baptist Church, where the only church they ever went to as a couple. And I was very fortunate. My mom lived till she was 97, and my dad until he was 100. And so they were married for 73 years. So my dad's my hero. In 19, my dad ended up working for a company in Knoxville, ended up not exactly sure exactly what happened, but he left the company. So he's looking for a job. Well, my grandfather, Mr. Highball, he had a goat dairy business. And so he asked my dad, he said, would you come and work with me just for a few months until you get a job? And so my dad said, sure, he's going to help out his father-in-law. Once you start, it's hard to leave. And my grandfather would always keep talking him into it. It was a money-losing business. And so my dad, being the loyal person that my dad is, he ended up, hey, Milky, he stayed with my grandfather and working for him. And then in 1960, both of my grandfathers passed away within 3 months of each other. My grandfather in Georgia was 69. My dad said he worried himself to death because as a farmer, you're always worried about the weather and everything. And my mother's dad, Mr. Highball, ended up dying of a heart attack. And so my grandfather basically left my grandmother penniless. And so they did everything they could do to sell the goat dairy to basically pay off all their debts. So my grandmother was 62 years old. My dad hated debt. He just, growing up in the Depression, he just could not stand debt. And so he ended up building, took out a loan and built a little one-room addition to our house. And so my grandmother came to live with us. So I grew up having my grandmother. Of course, we shared the same birthday, and she spoiled me rotten, loved her to death. And so we lived in basically a 2-bedroom, ended up being 3 once she joined us, but 2-bedroom, 1 bath, living room, small kitchen, and that was my normal. I had a great childhood growing up. So my dad ended up, after they sold the goat dairy, he was 42, and he ended up going into the life insurance business. My mom had started college before World War I, but when it came, she ended up going to work for what was called Tennessee Valley Authority as a draftsman. She's very artistic. And so, they get married, I had my brother, who's first child born, and she decided at the age of 40, Dad was 42, Mom was 40, to go back to college. So she wanted to get her teaching degree. She'd always done substitute teaching. And so she goes back and gets is getting her degree. Now, the irony in all of this is she's going back to college the same time as my brother. So my brother is riding to college, to UT with his mother. I mean, it was a real hoot. I ended up attending a county school, which was literally closer than here in the ball fields. I mean, that's how close the school was. And it was grades 1 through 8. And in the 6th grade is when you started changing classes. So county school didn't have middle school. It was just 1 through 8, and then high school was 9 through 12. And so they ended up having 2 different classes, 6A and 6B. And so guess which students were in 6A? The smart kids. And the rest of us were in 6B. And, I didn't really know until I was an adult the impact that had. I wasn't a smart kid, because that's basically what I was told. My mother told me as an adult that the principal of the elementary school told my mother I would amount to nothing. And so, I never heard those words, but just something about the environment. So my mother ended up taking me out of that school in the middle of the 7th grade, and I ended up going to a junior high school, a city school, until the 9th grade. I had a great high school. It lived in a small community in Knoxville called Fountain City. There was basically one high school that was fed by about 4 or 5 elementary schools. Was going to Central Baptist Church, where my parents were, and we had an incredible youth group. We didn't have a youth minister, we had a choir director, so all of the things centered around our youth choir. And we had 80 to 100 in our youth choir. We sang every Sunday night. We were the Sunday night choir. In fact, Sundays for us was Sunday morning Sunday school, then go to worship service, then after that, at 4:30 in the afternoon, we went to youth choir practice. 6:15, something called training union. And then at 7:30, we had worship service, and we get home, 8:30, 9 o'clock. That was our normal. Kids sports, there were no kids sports on Sunday, and there were very few sports on Saturday. Especially in the fall. Nothing happened in the fall because of UT football, and so University of Tennessee football. So I ended up graduating from high school in 1969. I was basically saved when I was 11 years old. Church had a revival. And don't remember anything that the preacher said, but I remember sitting in the balcony with my parents, and I just remember just God speaking to me. And so told my parents after church that during the service I accepted Christ. Well, they do what any good parent would do, is they said, well, we need to go talk to the pastor, is this real or whatever? And so ended up getting baptized a week later on a Sunday night with another guy who had been saved, Gary Hatfield. And so ended up just having a really great time. In high school, because of the youth choir and having just the opportunity to learn how to sing and stuff, I ended up getting into a couple of music groups. One was a folk music group. Peter, Paul, and Mary were the really, really popular groups back then, so we had a folk group that did that. I played the guitar, played the electric bass, even had a great big string bass. And 2 other guys that were in the choir who were much more talented than I were, we ended up forming a jazz trio. And so we started playing at any place that would have us play. And one of the guys had a little portable organ, and his dad had built him a little cart that he could take it on. So he'd take his portable organ, and I'd get one of the guys would be playing the guitar, the other guy would be playing the string bass. And I had a 1965 Chevy Impala 2-door fastback. And that string bass, I could fit it all the way back to the very back ledge, and the top of it would fit on the dashboard. And so that's how I carted that string bass around for years. Our pinnacle of our career is when we did this, and we did it all the way through freshman college. We got to be the opening act for Classics 4, which was a music group back then. Some of the old guys remember them. And so that was pretty neat. Stormy, that was it.
There you go.
The only problem was half of our repertoire was their music, and we couldn't sing it. Since they were. all the way through high school, except for my sophomore year, but I dated the same girl. There were about 20 of us that were just all the same age, or within age 1 or 2 ages of each other. And 16 of those 20 ended up marrying each other. I was not one of them. I ended up going to UT. My high school girlfriend went to Carson Newman College, and I was convinced we were going to get married. And so driving her back one Sunday night, halfway through her freshman year, she ended up breaking up with me. And that was definitely not my life plan. Growing up, I started working when I was 12 years old. I had a paper route, and then had another paper route. Mowed lawns, worked in a department store, shoe department store. And then the best job that I had was cleaning a laundromat. And so 7 nights a week, I would go to this laundromat and would clean it. And started when I was 16 years old. And the great thing about that is I got the car out every single night. So some nights it always took an hour to clean the laundromat. Sometimes a little less than that if you had other things to do. But it ended up being a great job, and worked various jobs, through college. So when I was in high school, my dentist started talking to me about becoming a dentist. And he was in his 50s, and he said, if you go through college, you can come to work for me and work for me for a number of years and, take over the practice. And he told me all the benefits of having a dentist, okay? And so he said, basically it was him. He had one lady that helped him, and then a lady that worked at the front desk. And he said, basically, you don't get calls at night. If you want to take off for vacation, you just block it off on the calendar. Like Dr. Cowley, he had a little cot in the back that he'd take a nap in the afternoon. And
that's what it is.
So I'm saying, man, this sounds great. So I went to UT. I started in pre-dentistry. Well, the fall quarter of my sophomore year, as I was struggling in organic chemistry, I asked this question: do I want to put my hands in people's mouths the rest of my life? And for me, the reality of the job just didn't match, all of the other things that I had. And that's one of the things that I've learned about myself. A lot of times I like the idea of something, but then the reality of it isn't there. I ended up floundering and not knowing what to do. High school girlfriend broke up with me. Didn't know what I was going to major in. So I just ended up deciding in Vietnam War was raging. They had instituted the draft the year before. My draft number was 150, and the year before, the draft went all the way through 190. And so I ended up deciding I was going to join the Army. So I went down to the recruiting office and joined the Army, and went through all the different things that they had, and got to the physical part of it. And it turns out I was on some medications, and the doctor basically looked at me and said, physically you really shouldn't be joining the Army. And he said, I remember he said, son, go back to college, get a degree. And so I ended up going back, and of course when I told my parents I was going to join the Army, they were mortified, okay? And so I ended up going back in and decided I was going to go into the School of Business. And my dad said, well, what are you going to do? I said, I'm just going to go in general business. And my dad said, no, you need to have specialty. And so he said, "You've got to pick something other than general business." This is exactly what I did. I went up in my bedroom, because I lived at home going to college first 2 years. And I got slips of paper, and I wrote down accounting, economics, finance, marketing, a couple of others, folded them up, put them in a little wicker basket, pulled one out. It said marketing. So I went down and said, "Dad, I'm going to major in marketing." So he said, "That's fine, just don't change." So ended up early 1971, and I'm 20 years old, and started going back to school, and started dating a high school senior, and really, really, really nice lady. And we started dating, and after a few months, we ended up getting engaged. I'll never forget, I took her to her high school prom, and her dad told her, she came from a dysfunctional family, but anyway, her dad told her, he said, "Look, if you want to stay out all night, you can." I had to be home at midnight, okay? Because I was living at home. So anyway, we got engaged. We were going to get married later that year. And on campus, I was looking for something to do during the summer, and I saw a little thing on the bulletin board that said that Burlington Industries had a marketing internship. And so I signed up for it and got it. And the idea would be that you would go through 2 years of internship, and you would work in New York City, working in, this happened to be the menswear division. So I ended up, the internship was in Fayetteville, North Carolina. For those of you who don't know, Fayetteville is the home of Fort Bragg. And I'd never been in a military town before, and that was a real trip. So I'm engaged, and I, first time I'd ever lived away from home, and went and found a room in a lady's house. She had an attic that they converted into an apartment, and ended up going to Snyder Memorial Baptist Church. It's a big church, very similar to Peachtree Corners. And while I was there, I remember going to the church, and I said, nobody here knows me. And it's like, whatever they know of me, it's going to be a test of who I am today, not who I have been all of my past. And so I decided to be this outgoing guy, and so they had a social that afternoon and first day, and so I went to the social and got to know people. And throughout the summer, several times I would drive back from Fayetteville all the way back to Knoxville, 7-hour drive, and do that on a Friday, turn around and come back on a Sunday. And towards the end of the summer, I just said, I'm just not ready to get married. And Nancy was a really sweet girl, and she really needed to get married, but I just wasn't ready. So I ended up breaking up with her, and there's no easy way to do that, and I know I didn't do it the best way that could have been done. So started my junior year, and ended up getting a job as an assistant dean at a dorm of a private high school. So I'm doing that. It was about a 30-minute drive between Knoxville and Pigeon Forge. And so ended up doing a commute there. And in about October of that year, 2 to 3 months after I'd broken off my engagement, my aunt called me. And my aunt was called a pink lady at a hospital. She was a volunteer at a hospital. And she would find nursing students who were from out of town, and she would just sort of adopt them. And so she said, "Look, I've got this nurse I'd like to introduce you to." I'm going, "Yeah, my aunt's wants to, set me up, But after 2 or 3 times, I finally said, "Okay, well, I'll meet this young lady. So she invited us over to dinner, and ended up meeting Susan, and we just sort of hit it off, and ended up started dating. So after a couple of years of dating, I went back for the second summer in North Carolina, in the Fayetteville area, a little small town south of there, and ended up getting engaged of April of my senior year. We're going to get married in September. So she graduated in June, and I graduated in August. So I started interviewing with jobs, and in the marketing department, the way that we did things was on a group basis, and we would do presentations as a group, and then the rest of the class would critique the presentations. And so I'm telling you what, I could critique a presentation. I could tell you everything that was wrong in that presentation in a not so kind way. So I was getting ready to graduate, and one of my marketing professors, Dr. Woodruff, said, "Hey, would you come by my office? I want to talk to you about something." So I went to his office, and he said, "Have you ever thought about going to graduate school?" And I said, "Nah, I haven't thought about going to graduate school." And he said, I really think you ought to go to graduate school." And I'm going, well, maybe that's for some people, but, I don't know if it's really for me. And he looked at me and he said, "Robert, if you go into business with the attitude you have right now, you'll be a royal failure." Now, I'm bawling in his office. And I said, I got to listen to this guy. So I ended up deciding to go to graduate school. If it hadn't been for him, I never would have gone. So in order to go into graduate school, you had to take what was called the ATGSB. I have it written down somewhere. It was an admissions test. And so I ended up taking the admissions test. By the way, when I was in high school, you could either take the SAT or you could take the ACT. The smart kids took the SAT. I took the ACT, okay? So I ended up taking I had a complete fellowship, tuition paid for, a small stipend already lined up through the marketing department. And I took the entrance exam, and basically called me in and said, "Well, I'm sorry, but your scores aren't high enough. According to statistics, you would not be successful in graduate school." And it was a state school, and so they couldn't prevent me from going, so they entered me and let me go in on probation. But the fellowship and everything went away. And so I ended up getting a job through the transportation department, and getting a job on a federal grant doing a project on van pooling, which was a real interesting project. Ended up being financially better off. So started graduate school, got married in September of that year, I was 23 years old. Susan started working as a nurse. We got our first apartment. I'm going through graduate school. In graduate school, I met this guy named Don Gosnell. And Don graduated 3 months before I did. He graduated in June. I didn't graduate till August. So he ended up going to work for a company called Burroughs Corporation. So I started interviewing around different jobs, and sort of like IBM, and they were a pretty popular place to go. And Don said, "Hey, you ought to come interview with my boss." So I went over and sat down with a guy named Ward Reed. He was in his 50s, cigar smoking, old school sales manager. And so he ended up hiring salespeople, and the only people he wanted were guys that had MBAs. And so I ended up starting in January of 1974 working for, this is January of 75, working for Burroughs Corporation as a sales rep. I was an okay sales rep. wasn't a great sales rep, but it's, an okay sales rep. We ended up having what they called vertical specialties, and so my specialties were two vertical industries I had were accounting firms and manufacturing. Now, when I went to school, I just could not get accounting. How can sales be a negative number? Have a minus sign on it, and they had T accounts and all. This accounting made no sense to me. I was good at math. I minored in statistics, but I didn't understand accounting. So here I am, ended up finding a third-party software package that was for accounting firms. And one of the things that sales reps had to do is you not only had to sell it, you had to install the software. So I found this third-party company out of Seattle and started selling their software. And I had to sit down and train these ladies on how to use the accounting software. Well, these ladies taught me bookkeeping, which they don't teach in college. And when I saw an invoice, and this is where you enter it in, and this how it flows to the general ledger, and this how that flows to the income statement, it all began to make sense. And so I actually was pretty successful in selling accounting firms and ended up selling a system to one of the largest local firms called Hickman Pugh & Company. Well, they ended up coming to me and saying, hey, we've got this big client, and they're a construction company, and they want us to provide them services. And do you have any software for construction companies? Well, Burroughs had a software package called Construction Management System, and it ran on a pretty good sized computer, biggest computer I'd ever sold. So I sold this computer and software to this firm. And again, my responsibility was to get the software installed. The software had been ported over from an IBM computer. It was a System 3 computer from IBM that was based on 96 column cards. And so they had taken this program and ported it over to have it run on a disk. So we got the software, we got hardware installed, we started installing the software, and the software didn't work. And trying to get help from Burroughs Corporation wasn't happening. So the software was written in a programming language called RPG, Report Program Generator. And so I ended up getting a manual and started teaching myself RPG. And I was not going to let this software fail. So again, I'm a sales rep, by the way. On nights and weekends, I started programming and reprogramming this software. And the funny thing was the programs, I told them, I said, you've got to send me the source code for these programs. The way they sent the source code, it came in 96 column cards. So I had to get a card reader to attach to the computer at the office so that I could take all these things and reprogram this program. So ended actually becoming pretty proficient in RPG, and we actually got the software running. I'll never forget working 24 hours a day for 3 straight days because payroll was going to be on Friday, and we had to get that payroll out, and we ended up getting it out. Well, the guy had left Burroughs and had started a contract programming company doing custom software. And he gave me a call and he said, I understand you understand RPG. And he said, yeah. He says, well, I've got a contract on a program that they want it written for an IBM computer, an RPG. My programmers don't know it. Would you come teach us RPG? So I said, sure. So, nights and weekends, I would go to their office and I would teach these programmers RPG. So in 1970, this is in late 1976, I ended up going down to Atlanta to a regional sales meeting. And one of the things that they were doing is they wanted to introduce us to several software companies that had programs on Burroughs computers. And so one of the guys that was there was a guy named Richard Brock, and he had a software program for Burroughs computers for accounting firms. And they had developed it on IBM System 32, and they had ported it over to Burroughs because at that point in time, we were killing IBM in the small computer marketplace. And so he said, look, I was losing out to different people. He said, I've got to have it for both Burroughs and for IBM. So one of the things that he offered was, he says, look, if any of you want me to come up to your branch, I'll come up, make a presentation. You can invite a bunch of accounting firms in. And he said, I'll come do the presentation. So I said, hey, I'd like to have you if you'd be willing to come to Knoxville. And so he said, sure, I'll be glad to do that. So in January of the next year, Richard came up to Knoxville, and I met him at 8 o'clock, and we went into the demo room. And in the demo room was a computer that we did our demos on. And one of the guys that was working there was a programmer. And because of the relationship that we had with this contract programming firm, they could use the computers at night compiling programs, and as long as they were gone by the start of business day. So Richard comes in, and there's this programmer who's sitting, working on Burroughs' computer. Says, "What are you doing?" He said, "Well, I'm working on some programs." And he says, "Oh, really?" He says, "Yeah." He said, "Yeah." He said, "We're porting it over from a System 32 to Burroughs." "Well, what language is it written in?" He said, "RPG." And he was one of the programmers I had programmed, that I had taught programming. And so Richard said, Burroughs, IBM, RPG. So he ended up about a month later hiring the programmer. And the guy moves to Atlanta. So about 4 or 5 months later, I got a call from the programmer. And he said, Richard's getting ready to hire his first sales rep. You ought to interview for the job. So I interviewed with Richard, and he said, I knew Burroughs, I knew IBM, I knew accounting software, and so he hired me. So in December of 1977, Susan and I had our first child, which was Andy. And in April of 1978, I ended up getting a job moving to Atlanta. So I moved to Atlanta with the only grandchild. And for another time in my life, my parents were not happy with me. So we ended up moving to Atlanta in 1978. And if you take a look at how I got to Atlanta, a marketing professor, graduate school, meeting a guy named Don Gosnell. He works at Burroughs. I go to work at Burroughs. I sell a software program written in RPG. I train programmers in RPG. Me getting down here, I can look back and say, this is nothing but God. Also in 1977, before we moved down here, earlier that year, I had been ordained as a deacon. Our church had a lot of older deacons, and they said, hey, we need to get some younger guys in here. So I ended up being a deacon. So we moved into Marietta in 1978, and with a 4-month-old. And made a mistake. I didn't understand how much of a mistake it was at that time. But we just didn't get involved in the church very quickly. So my Susan was really had difficulty making friends. She was very much of an introvert. So she's at home with a 4-month-old, doesn't know anybody. I'm going to work every day. I've got all these other people that I know and everything, and I'm sort of in my own world. And so it caused some stress on the marriage. So we ended up going to a church called Piedmont Baptist Church, and got very active. And after about a year, Susan began to make some friends, and we made a couple friends. I taught a married Sunday school class, was a deacon in the church, actually ran the AV in this back little closet, and did all sorts of different volunteer work at the church. In September of 1979, our second son was born, and his name was Michael. And Andy and Michael were 22 months apart. When Michael was 2 years old, he started having this, just started wanting to drink a lot. So he's drinking a lot, 2 years old, and urinating a lot. And we took him to the doctor, and at 2 years old, he was diagnosed as an insulin-dependent diabetic. And so we started having to give him shots. Back then, you couldn't test blood sugar. You had to test their urine. So we'd literally get a syringe, suck the urine out of his diaper, and put it on these little test strips to see, where was he. And more stress on the family. So after about 5 years, we ended up having our second son, Michael, which I told you about. He's a diabetic. So after about 5 years, the company, MCS, had grown. I was just at the right place at the right time. First sales rep, Richard asked me, said, "Hey, would you like to redo our marketing brochure?" And so, man, I'd do anything I could do to help him out. And so Andy ended up becoming Executive Vice President of Marketing, Sales, and Administration. The company grew very rapidly and ended up being bought. Richard sold the company 5 years later. And Richard decided to stay with the company. So I ran half of the company. It was about 200 people. And a guy named Charlie Paparelli ran the other half of the company. So I ran Marketing, Sales, Administration. He ran all the technical side. So the question was going to be, who was going to replace Richard as president? Was it going to be Charlie, or was it going to be me? And they ended up choosing Charlie. And one thing Charlie and I both knew, there's no way we were going to work for each other, And so it's 1978, and I'm looking, going, what am I going to do? Well, about that time, a guy named Jim Porter, who was the guy we reported to in California in informatics, he said, there's a division in Dallas, Texas, life insurance division, one of their larger divisions, and they need a marketing person. And so if you go down there, go in a staff position, for a couple of years, then, that'll be a stepping stone to maybe go run another division someplace. So ended up having a phone call with a guy named Spec Bradley. He ended up flying down to Dallas, did an interview, and basically came back and said, "Hey, Susan, we've got a job in Dallas. We're moving to Dallas." I never asked her opinion. I just figured she'd be all this excited about it. And so in 1983, we ended up moving to Dallas. In the fall of '82, our third son was born, Nick. So here we go to Dallas with a 5-year-old, a 3-year-old and a 6-month-year-old. And so once we got there, I learned from my previous lesson, we got involved in the church very quickly. Ended up going to First Baptist Church of Richardson, and it was a great church. Ended up teaching a married Sunday school class there. Ended up being a deacon. I did what I had done at the previous 2 churches. We started a program called Deacon Family Ministry Plan, and life was really good. So I'm only going to be there 2 years, and going to move someplace else. Well, about 18 months into being there, informatics started getting a bit of a hostile takeover by another software company. So in order to fend off the hostile takeover, they ended up selling our division to our number 1 competitor. So 3 days before Christmas in 1970, I'll figure the year out in a minute, they ended up having a called meeting of all employees at the Doubletree Hotel. So we go to the Doubletree Hotel. We all pretty much knew something was up. We just didn't know exactly what it was. And so we go and we end up finding we're sold to our number 1 competitor. And from the stage, they said, I know a bunch of you, it's holidays, I know a bunch of you have got vacations planned. Go ahead, take your vacations. We're not going to decide anything till after the first of the year. So we were already packed and ready to go. So we ended up coming back for Tennessee and went back to Dallas the first Sunday of 1985, in January of 1985, and walked into the door. And while I was gone, they'd made all their decisions on who was going to be retained and who wasn't. And it really wasn't a surprise to me that I wasn't going to be retained because I was in a staff position. And they didn't need another vice president of marketing. They already had a marketing group. So I go back to the office, and about 2 weeks before that, about 3 weeks before that, in early December, I'd gotten a call from a recruiter. And he said, I've got a little small software company in the insurance industry, and they're looking for basically someone to come in and run the division. Well, back then, we didn't have voicemail. You had these little pink slips that secretaries would write the phone number on. So I'm going back to my office and I'm going, did I keep that pink slip? Where's that pink slip? Son of a gun, if I didn't, find that pink slip. So I called the recruiter. They hadn't hired anybody. So I went and interviewed with a guy named Ford Albritton Jr. He was 65 years old. He was a multimillionaire. He had bought and sold several companies. And he had, the biggest company he had was called Albritton Development. Actually had an office here in Atlanta for a while. And he had basically turned that company over to his son and son-in-law, and he decided to start more companies. So he started a oil and gas exploration company, a real estate development company doing strip centers, and he had found this little small software company in the life insurance industry. And he had started his career in life insurance. And software program was basically an activity tracking system to track the activity for life insurance salesmen. And he was convinced this was going to revolutionize the insurance industry. So he hired me to come in and basically figure out how to make this into a company. So I went in there, and first thing I did is, evaluate the technology behind it, and it was a great idea, but poorly written. So I told him, I said, we're going to have to redevelop the software, and it's going to be expensive. To him, money just wasn't an issue. To give you an idea, he was a big Texas A&M grad, big Aggie fan, big recruiter, booster. And on the Texas A&M campus, there's what's called the All-Britain Carillon Tower that he built. And he told me that when he had his manufacturing company, he hired football players during the summer to come to work for him. And so working for him is the first time I'd ever been around opulent wealth. You know, I'm this hick guy who grew up in Tennessee, okay? And the offices were ceiling to floor mahogany. I mean, it was something else. So we started developing the programs and building the staff, and ended up hiring the salesman. And I really thought that I had been hired to basically be president. And but Mr. All-Britain, he was a really smart guy. And I think one of the things that he realized was I probably wasn't going to be the right guy to be president. But the other thing he realized, he needed somebody that had credibility in the insurance industry and that could really sell this program. So we ended up spending a lot of money to hire a guy who had a insurance agency in Dallas with one of the large insurance companies. So this guy came in, Mike came in as president. And so he was really focusing on sales. The rest of the company reported to me. So we finally got to the point where Mike was able to get us to where we could do our first sales presentation to a real prospect. And so the sales reps went in, did a presentation. I'm in the back of the room. I'm taking notes. So after the presentation's over, we went back to the office. Presentation went really well. But I proceeded to tell them everything they did wrong. And that was on a Friday. On a Saturday, Mike called me into his office, and he said, "Robert, you know, you're a talented guy, but you're the worst manager I have ever seen." And he said, "I'm not going to fire you. I want you to work for me, and I want you to help us develop the sales presentation and also develop an investor presentation to bring in more investors." And so, I decided, thank you, I appreciate the opportunity, I'll do it. And I made a vow to myself right then, I would never manage people ever again. And so I loved what I was doing, working for him. We ended up, Mr. All-Britain didn't do anything second class. So he had a private plane. So we'd get on his private plane and we'd fly into cities doing sales presentations. He had always wanted us to stay in four-season hotels, to have the appearance of being a big, successful company, et cetera. So we started making progress in making those sales things. And in late December of 1985, OPEC decided to increase production. And when they decided to increase production, the price of oil plummeted. And when the price of oil plummeted, Texas went into an immediate recession. Mr. All-Britain's cash-producing assets were oil and gas. And so he ended up closing down the oil and gas exploration system. Real estate market had dried up, so he closed that down, but he kept the software company. But he knew he had to reduce cost. Well, he had hired another guy. Yeah.
Can I just interject real quick? So just for the sake of time, we're almost drawing close to an end. So if there's somebody that has to leave, I still see John here. John normally leaves.
No school today.
Oh, there's no school today. Okay, so yeah, if somebody has to leave, then totally fine.
Okay.
Almost.
And so he knew he had to reduce costs. Well, there's two guys. He had hired another guy in marketing as well, and that was really reporting to Mike. And he and I were the same age. We had both started our careers at Burroughs, both did marketing. And so the question was, who is he going to choose? I'd been there longer. So was he going to keep me or his son? So, here I was unemployed. They treated me very nicely. They gave me an office, computer, so that I could start looking for, first time I'd ever looked for a job. There was a book back then called What Color is Your Parachute? So I started reading that book, and I did everything the book said, and I'd make a list of all these different people to call. And there was one name that kept popping up that I just wouldn't call, Spec Bradley, because I just sort of blamed him for the situation that I was in. Well, Spec was a Christian, and when life's totally out of control, it's spiritually invigorating, and that was one of the greatest times of spiritual growth I ever had. So I finally called Spec back, and I said, "You still have your Bible study going on?" He said, "Yeah," and I had attended his Bible study in the past, so I went and attended the Bible study, and Spec said, "Well, Robert, tell us what's going on." And I sort of explained to him what was going on. I was looking for a job, and I decided that I wanted to focus on finding a job doing acquisitions. I figured that was a job that I had some experience in, and I wouldn't have to manage anybody. So at the end of the Bible study, Spec said, "Have you got a copy of your resume?" And I said, "Yeah." So I pulled it out, never leave home without it. And so unbeknownst to me, Spec took his business card and wrote on his business card, attached it to my resume, and said, "Larry, here's a Christian businessman you ought to consider." And he sent it to Larry Dean, president of SSI on East Jones Bridge Road. So Larry gave me a call, and we're talking for about 30 minutes. And he said, "Robert, I've been looking for 2 years for somebody to do what you want to do." He said, "I already think I've got a place for you." So ended up flying out, and interview went well. And so in 1986, we moved into Peachtree Corners. Started working for Larry. It was Camelot. If you ever talk to anybody that's been there, talk to your dad, it was Camelot. This is back in the 80s, casual dress. I'm talking shorts, T-shirts. I mean, the property off of East Jones Bridge was an incredible, beautiful property right on the river. And it was Camelot. I'm doing great. I'm doing acquisitions. I don't manage anybody. It was wonderful. Well, about 18 months later, the company reorganized, and Larry said, "Robert, you need to manage the marketing department." And I'm going, "Larry, I don't manage people." You don't say no to an entrepreneur. But anyway, I now had the marketing department. This time, rather than being the macro manager, task-oriented guy I'd always been, I just pretty much let them do their thing. If you need any help, you let me know. Still have my job doing acquisitions. And so life was really good. Larry ended up, the company was a public company, and the company ended up being bought by NYNEX, one of the rail regional Bell operating companies out of New York. And so they ended up buying the company in 1990. And so I was reporting to Larry, and in 1993, they ended up deciding to sell the company. Let me back up just a little bit. So I'm working for Larry, managing the marketing department. In late 1989, Susan and I were attending Dunwoody Baptist Church. I was teaching married Sunday school class. She was sang in the choir. I'd been asked to be chairman of the deacons. I worked with a group called RAs on Wednesday nights. In late 1989, I just started seeing a change in Susan and didn't know what it was. And in January of 1990, she said, I think I need to go live with my sister for a while. And so she ended up moving out and never came back. And so she eventually, 3 months later, got an apartment in Union City, which is south of the airport. And I had 3 boys, ages 10, 7, and 5. Being a single parent is the most hardest thing I've ever done in my life. You're in survival mode. And I kept asking her if she would ever come back, and she said no. And basically in 1990, we ended up getting a divorce. Going back to church was hard. I ended up having to resign as chairman of the deacons. I had to resign teaching a married Sunday school class. And I'm separate. I didn't feel like I wanted to go to the singles class. Couldn't go back to the married class. So, I attended worship services twice for a while. Then I ended up hanging out with 3-year-olds playing my guitar. And the most difficult time I ever went through. Well, in 1991, we got a divorce, and I attended a Bible study at SSI. I had started attending it ever since I had started the company. I'd been attending it 5-6 years. And there was a lady in there whose name was Brenda Dobbs. And she was a programmer. And I really didn't know much about her except what we said in Bible study. And I thought she had a real problem with men, because when we would get to these passages on submission, she'd really bristle. But anyway, we ended up talking to each other because we had something in common, and ended up started dating. And 2 years later, in 1993, March of 1993, we got married. She'd been divorced for 8 years. I'd been divorced for 2 years. We started dating way too soon. I was not healed from my divorce. And we had a lot of problems in our marriage. So we've been married for 3 months. NineX decided to sell our company. And so the officers were trying to figure out, what's Larry Dean going to do? Is Larry going to buy the company back? He's not going to buy the company back. And so we went into an officers meeting, and on a Friday morning, Larry said, well, I've decided I'm not going to buy the company back. I'm going to retire. And he said, somebody's got to run the company. Who wants to be president? I had never had any interest in being president. But there were 2 other guys that had been talking to me and said, if Larry retires, he may want somebody to run this. We really think you ought to consider it. And I don't know why, but I raised my hand. And another guy named John Stevens raised his hand. He'd been with the company 20 years. I'd been with the company 7 years. Larry said, well, tell us why you want to be president. I have no idea what I said. And so after 45 minutes, he had us leave, go out of the room. And 30 minutes later, called us back in, said, Robert, you're the new president. I got on the phone. I said, Brenda, we got to talk. Been married 3 months. Now I'm president of a company that's being sold. The company ended up being sold to a financial investment firm out of New York called Welch, Carson, Anderson, and Stowe. They bought another company from NineX in Baltimore that was also in the banking software business, merged it under us, and now as president and CEO of a company. And by the way, did I ever tell you I never wanted to manage people?
Yeah.
And so after 3 years, Welch Carson's like anybody else, they bought us to sell us. And after 3 years, they ended up getting an offer from a company called Check Free. And so Check Free made an offer to buy the company. And so they bought the company, and a guy named Pete Kite ran the company. And on March the 1st of 1996, I got to graduate. So he wasn't interested in keeping around the previous CEO. After that, I ended up working for a couple of other technology companies. In 1994, the last piece of this program was in late 1994, a program came out called Divorce Care. And a lady at Dunwoody Baptist Church said, would you consider helping us start Divorce Care? I really wasn't interested, but she said, hey, meet me after church, and I just want you to watch one video. So we met her after church, watched one video, and Brenda and I were hooked. So in the fall of 1994, we started Divorce Care. After 2 years, Nick was getting ready to go into the youth program, and we were living in Peachtree Corners, driving all the way to Dunwoody, and we decided that, hey, maybe we could plant the program in a church somewhere in Peachtree Corners. So first church we called was Peachtree Corners, made an appointment with Bob Horner. He called in David Shaw, and we basically said, you know, would you be open to us starting a program for people who are separated and divorced? And Bob said, I'd love to do that. So in the fall of 1996, we started Divorce Care at PCBC, and been doing it ever since. And after we joined the church, there was a little thing in the bulletin that said, if you're interested in joining a little small group called Home Builders, meet in C Assembly after the worship service. So we went down there, and it was just basically a group that would get together, once a month and basically go through this curriculum called Home Builders. So we started that and went through the first, book of curriculum, 6 months, and I said, hey, let's do it again. So we did it again, and our group is still going. And in fact, Saturday night, we'll have in our Home Builders group, all we've done is go through books on marriage and parenting. And so for 27 years, we've done two things: divorce recovery and marriage. And that's been our two passions. And the one thing that Brenda and I made a decision to do was whatever we did at church, we do together. My first marriage, church was the most dividing thing that we had. It was all good stuff, but there was never anything that we did together. And so this is just for us as a couple. And so we've really done that. You either get both of us or you don't get us at all. We've only had one exception to that. And so we've loved being at Peachtree Corners. They've been very, very supportive of us. And that's sort of my life story.
Thank you. Thank you, Earl.
Thank you.
So
You guys got any questions?
I will pass just a few things right here. In 1996, we went on a missions trip to Albania. These are a couple of pictures of that. Picture of when Brenda and I got married with the boys. They were 12, 10, and 7. And like I said, we went through a lot of problems in our marriage. And here we are with problems in our marriage, and we're leading a divorce recovery group. And these divorce tapes are bringing up all these issues in our marriage that we hadn't resolved, especially me. And, and we're supposed to be facilitating the group. And so Divorce Care, quite frankly, really helped our marriage. And We've been married on March the 6th, we'll have been married 31 years. So that's it.